Welcome to One Last Take, a podcast about seeing film from every angle. I'm Wes Skinner, and today's episode is the first installment in a monthly series I'm calling The Good, the Bad, and the Underrated. Hope you enjoy. In this series, I'll be covering the past month of new releases, sharing some broad thoughts and recommendations, and then selecting the three that stood out to me the most, each in very different ways. I'll talk about one I really enjoyed, one I really didn't, and one I'd consider a hidden gem worth seeking out. These episodes will be on the shorter side and may vary in structure and length with each installment based on what I find worth mentioning for any given month. So think of this as your monthly One Last Take newsletter. Before we move on to the good, the bad, and the underrated for this month, I want to play catch up and talk about a pair of movies that technically came out last year, but that I was finally able to see recently. In my Movies of 2025 episode, I mentioned I hadn't yet seen No Other Choice or The Testament of An Lee, and since then I've caught up with both. And I have to say, I enjoyed them so much there's a good chance they both would have ended up in my top 10, which only further proves the strength of last year's offerings. No Other Choice is yet another genre-blending thriller from master Park Chan-wook, who for some reason continues to get ignored by the Academy, but not on this show. I'll never forget the early days of cable on demand. I saw this striking thumbnail above the title Old Boy, having no idea what it's about, and it's safe to say that if 13-year-old me never clicked play on that screen, you might not be listening to this very podcast. So yeah, Park's films have always had an impact on me. His ability to consistently make thought-provoking original works that bend and break traditional storytelling conventions is second to none. So am I surprised that he does it yet again with No Other Choice? Somehow yes, because it doesn't seem possible that anyone would still have this many tools at their disposal after seemingly dumping the entire toolbox on the table over the past 3 decades. But here he is, yet again, tapping into that same excitement I felt watching Old Boy all those years ago. The genius of a Park Chan-wook film always starts with the simplicity of its premise. In No Other Choice, that premise is that Man-soo, played by South Korean legend Lee Byung-hung, has lost his stable job in middle management at a paper company, and he'll do just about anything to get it back. While the antics that ensue are bloody, messy, and darkly funny, Park never forgets to tether them to the empathy of a family in crisis, which helps explain while never fully condoning Man-soo's extreme actions. That balance keeps the movie from having to pick a lane, effectively walking a tightrope of intense thriller, dark satire, and family drama. And as always, these ideas of capitalistic pressure and finding purpose in a 9-to-5 are universal and carry as much resonance through an American perspective as they do in Park's native South Korea. So yeah, I can only assume at this point that the Academy has some weird grudge against Park, because this is one of the most exciting and original offerings we got from last year, and that says a lot considering the high bar the year set. Maybe by the time he makes his 9th or 10th consecutive banger they'll finally catch up, but who knows. Shortly after, I caught up with a film that drew me in from its mysterious and hypnotic trailer months ago, and that's The Testament of An Lee. A far cry from Amanda Seyfried's last outing, The Housemaid, this one sees her as the founder of the Shaker movement, an offshoot of the Quakers known for their rhythmic chants and intense body movements, hence the name. So it's only natural that this film is a musical, but the ways in which it is are deeply specific and profoundly moving. The Testament of An Lee is directed by Mona Fastvold, one half of the married writing team that did both this and the other half Brady Corbet's The Brutalist, and of the two I very much preferred Fastvold's work here. I should preface that for whatever reason I've always been drawn to unique approaches to the musical formula, so while this might not be for everyone, it is very much for me. Something about organic emotions pouring out of someone to the point where they can only express it in song and dance is viscerally stirring to me in a way I can't really explain. And despite being a devout atheist, I also find myself drawn to stories of faith, especially when it's portrayed in a complicated light. While I can never believe in any of this stuff myself, I very much understand and empathize with the emotional pull and need for answers to life questions that often draw people into that way of thinking. In short, I don't believe you need to be a religious person to appreciate this or any other movie that depicts religion, as long as it isn't being preachy or talking down to its audience. For example, this movie never insists that An Lee is doing the right thing. It simply depicts her intense commitment to her cause and everything that led her to pour so much of herself into a cult-like matriarchal role. And Seyfried pours just as much into the role of Anne. While the entire cast is great, you just can't look past what she's doing here. Many people already know that her singing voice is incredible, but she also dances fiercely, spent a year learning this accent, and flat out becomes this character. And if there's a single part of this film that belongs at the Oscars, though I feel there are at least a few, it's her. And if this movie sounds like one of those heavy period pieces that you really need to be in a patient headspace for, let me assure you that that's far from the case. The film moves with the intense rhythm of its pounding score, with songs modeled after actual Shaker hymns that are far more catchy than one might expect. The camera lingers on the details of faces and heavy emotional numbers, while the rousing chants are brought to life with stunning wide angles and forceful choreography. This is a powerful, kinetic, cinematic experience that if you can't tell at this point, I'm going to recommend you try and catch in a theater if possible. Unless, of course, this really isn't your thing, in which case I would understand. But if you go in with an open mind and an open heart, you might just be as moved as I was. Finally, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Arco, a French animated sci-fi adventure that I was lucky enough to see at last year's New Hampshire Film Festival, but is just now hitting theaters. I expressed my thoughts on it in last week's episode, but wanted to bring it up in case you were looking for something fresh to see in theaters this week. And with that, we're officially leaving the films of 2025 behind. It was a fantastic year in film and surely a tough act to follow, but I'm remaining optimistic that excitement in the theaters will sustain well into 2026. Normally, a new year in film is a double-edged sword, given the negative reputation of January releases historically, but this year's premiere month turned out to be a pretty pleasant surprise overall. And now for the good, the bad, and the underrated of January 2026. First, let's talk about the good. And I couldn't give this title to anything else this month but the movie I was most hoping and praying would be good despite its January release. And that's 28 years later, The Bone Temple. Shot not long after its predecessor and released a mere 7 months later, I was both excited and a little nervous at the prospect of getting a sequel so soon after riding the highs of how shockingly good that last film was. And I was also a little worried seeing the reins taken out of the sure hands of Danny Boyle and handed over to Nia DaCosta, a director with a filmography that doesn't come anywhere near reflecting her talent as an artist. So to my surprise and overwhelming relief, DaCosta gave us yet another exciting entry in the series that holds on tight to what makes the best of these movies work while venturing into bold new territory and evolving into something else entirely. The Bone Temple picks up where the last one left off, with young survivor Spike fending for himself in the apocalypse against feral infected, and a new potential threat in the form of a gang of wig-wearing weirdos who collectively go by the name of Jimmy, the leader of whom, played by Jack O'Connell, is convinced he's the son of the devil. Meanwhile, Ralph Fiennes returns in a brilliant performance as the curious and hopeful Dr. Kelson, who now spends his days studying a hulking infected he calls Samson, in hopes of using him to find some sort of cure. From the film's opening moments, the tone is somehow bleaker and more dangerous than ever, as Spike is pitted against one of the Jimmies in a fight to the death to reluctantly earn a place among them. DaCosta announces her stylistic intentions immediately, with shots swirling around the gang as they surround Spike like a swarm of bees. Both narratively and visually, DaCosta is a slightly more straightforward storyteller than Boyle, but that works great given how things have progressed. If the last film represented the rapid blur of hasty, youthful decisions, this one is a sobering, uncomfortable look at having to live in the horrors of reality the moment you're old and wise enough to understand them. Alfie Williams, returning as Spike, depicts the sense of dread beautifully, but one of the biggest surprises the film had to offer is that it doesn't really belong to him. Instead, his uncertain future is faced with two hypothetical ones, in the form of O'Connell's self-proclaimed heir to the Satanic throne and Fiennes' Kelson. After a series of pretty horrifying events, the gang eventually circles back to Kelson's titular Bone Temple, and this is when it becomes clear the purpose of the second chapter in an alleged trilogy is to pit these opposing ideologies against each other. One leans into the collapsing nature of the world around them, while the other desperately holds on to the good that he still believes lives on in those still on Earth. The initial meeting of these two characters is one of the most dramatically explosive scenes in the film and an easy highlight in both actors' respective careers. From there, the tension only dials up further and carefully sets up one of the most heavy metal third acts of possibly any movie ever. I refuse to spoil it, but believe me when I say it's an unexpected, electrifying showstopper of a climax that is thrilling, hilarious, and downright badass all at once. And Fiennes is asked to do some things that, without full commitment, could have completely deflated the movie of everything it had worked toward until that point. But thankfully for all of us, he commits, and then some. 28 years later, The Bone Temple is a surprisingly small-scale and singular chapter in Spike's otherwise sprawling story, and I think it ultimately benefits from slowing down and zooming in on what makes these characters tick. This has continued to be one of the most delightfully weird and unlikely genre franchises ever made, and I never get tired of being completely caught off guard by every new installment. The epilogue widens the scope of the story in ways that set the next film up to be a pretty stellar finale, and I'm already dying to see what comes next. Now, as with all things, we must take the good with the bad, and while this was a pretty solid January at the movies compared to most, there were some that felt right at home in what is often nicknamed Dumpuary, none more so than Chris Pratt's vehicle, Mercy. This movie wins the King Dud of the Month award, not because it's the worst movie I've ever seen or anything, but because it's a typical Hollywood display of settling for mediocrity. This near-future thriller about a cop on trial for being the prime suspect in his own wife's murder via an AI program known as Mercy could have really been something interesting in a small-scale format that actually explores this alternate world and asks deeper questions about the concept. Instead, it seems content with avoiding the existential ideas it hints at in favor of hollow spectacle that resembles enough of a blockbuster to get the average moviegoer to attend. They even pushed the IMAX format for this, which is strange considering the movie is essentially Chris Pratt web surfing to prove his innocence for an hour and a half. The angle just feels really awkward, and I could even accept hollow spectacle if it wasn't constantly committing the cardinal sin of any sci-fi universe, which is breaking its own rules. The problem with over-explaining how an AI Rebecca Ferguson serves as judge, jury, and executioner is that the audience is going to remember everything you tell them. So when you start contradicting these rules every 10 minutes just to strain suspense or write your way out of a corner, people are going to notice. Now I'm going to break my usual habit of avoiding spoilers here because another grievance I have with this thing is that it honestly just spoils itself. Almost every twist and turn is telegraphed from a mile away, with a character practically winking at the camera 30 minutes before it happens. Being predictable isn't necessarily a bad thing if the story has other things to invest its dramatic stock in. But this movie has nothing. It's literally a mystery, and they go all in on that part of it. So when they make a huge deal about the first guy that Pratt arrested and put into the Mercy program, are we supposed to be surprised when it comes back to haunt him? Are we supposed to be surprised that Pratt's partner, who constantly insists of the importance of the Mercy program, hid evidence to prove its efficiency? We shouldn't, because random things happen throughout the script that only make sense if they're written with the intention to pay off in the future. So putting one and one together for the audience isn't just obvious, it's inevitable. It's all just lazy writing, and it makes something that had all the ingredients to be a fun night at the movies a frustrating mess. And don't even get me started on how they somehow managed to make Rebecca Ferguson an off-putting screen presence. Her AI character seems to bounce between cold and calculating to thoughtful to snarky, seemingly whenever the script needs her to switch things up. And Chris Pratt is Chris Pratt. He's fine, I guess, but he's not the type of actor who can elevate material this week. All of this is to say, I wouldn't be as annoyed with this movie if it didn't tease its potential every so often with interesting ideas, only to undercut them with something completely unearned or tonally jarring. Even the emotion that Pratt spends the whole movie trying to force through his performance gets deflated. One scene, for example, sees him reaching out to his daughter while on trial approximately 40 minutes before he'll be sentenced to death. And despite being fully aware of this, she yells at him for looking at her phone records earlier, which, as a reminder, he was trying to do to find evidence to save his life. I don't understand this movie. The takeaway here is that the next time I see some bright white poster with Chris Pratt in some near future setting, I'm running for the hills. And no, Mercy is not the first to fit that description. Thankfully, nothing else I saw this month disappointed me on that scale, so I'm happy to say we can safely pivot back into positive territory now. Which leads me into my underrated pick for the month. There could be a few here that I don't think got enough attention, including the 80s style throwback Primate, which was a fun, gory time with a refreshing amount of practical effects. But for my pick here, I'm going all the way back to the first movie I saw in theaters this year, We Bury the Dead. Apparently this was just a great time of year for infection-themed zombie-adjacent horror movies. Because like DaCosta with Bone Temple, director Zach Hilditch manages to find yet another new angle to approach this material. The film kicks off with the US accidentally detonating a chemical weapon off the coast of Tasmania, wiping out an entire city's population with one small twist. Some of them are coming back from the dead and exhibiting strange behavior. Daisy Ridley stars as a volunteer who travels to the site of the disaster and hopes to find her husband, who is there for a work trip. From there, we get a somber sort of pre-apocalyptic meditation of grief and unresolved personal conflicts that I found surprisingly emotional at every turn. Between this and 2024's Magpie, this is the second year in a row Ridley has been a part of some cool indie flick that's been completely unseen ever since she left the Star Wars world. And once again, there's a lot being asked of her, and she really delivers. I want to start out by saying this movie is going to disappoint anyone who goes in expecting a zombie kill fest. Because while there are a few traditional horror set pieces, that's just not really what they're going for here. The film uses the undead less as an encroaching threat and more as lingering reminders of their past lives and relationships. Each infected victim that does reanimate acts a little differently. Some are violent, some are just standing in corners of rooms, and others seem to be trying to accomplish some sort of unresolved task. When the undead are killed, we're left more conflicted than we would be in, say, The Walking Dead. Like there is still some hope or life left in each and every one of them. The movie never provides an entirely concrete explanation, though, which might bother some people, but I was perfectly okay with it, given the thematic material it allowed the narrative to chew on. The framework the film follows is similar to that of a road movie, as Ridley's lead ventures outside the designated safe zone of the disaster site to find her husband. Along the way, she has all sorts of encounters, dead or otherwise, as we're slowly fed the whole story of her marriage through occasional flashbacks. By the time we get the full picture, it's a pretty devastating one and further contextualizes her desperate need for closure. And of course, like with most of these stories, the surviving humans serve as the real danger, and that's represented here in an intense second-act twist that is as disturbing as it is deeply tragic. You might have guessed at this point that this movie is a bit of a downer, and it can be pretty heavy at times, but it never stops moving forward. We as the audience are taking every step with our hero, scouring through the wreckage, searching for some sort of hope. And while what lies at the end isn't quite what we expect, there is an ounce of light in the film's closing moments, in the form of an unexpected and beautiful catharsis. I won't go any further into details, but I do think the surprising left turn this movie takes right before the credits really sticks the emotional landing. This is the kind of release I want in January. A surprising, daring genre flick with a niche approach that might not be for everyone, but is there to connect with whoever will make the trip to see it. And that's the good, the bad, and the underrated for January 2026. Be sure to tune in next time, where I'll be discussing my thoughts on this year's Oscar nominations, including my picks, predictions, and how I've never heard of anything in the shorts or documentaries categories. I've also included my Letterboxd link in the description so you can keep up with everything I'm watching in between shows. And that's all I've got for now. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.